Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We are taking a deep dive into impact measurement, and our host today is Samuel Baumgartner, and our head of impact, Paul Hailey, is also here. He's a little nervous to be called the man with the answers, but I've never seen him fail to deliver, so I'm sure he will today. First, as people are still signing in, I will give you a little bit of housekeeping. You are all muted, so if you have a question, just type it into the chat function on the side of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to it either in the Q&A, or worst case scenario, Samuel or Paul will write you personally after the webinar. A little bit about responsAbility. We are one of the pioneers of impact investing. We invest in financial inclusion, which helps to empower millions of people in emerging markets. And we also invest in sustainable food, which supports sustainable production and collaboration with smallholder farmers. And our climate finance initiatives have reached nearly $1 billion US. All right, over to you, Samuel and Paul, and I will be back for the question and answer period.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stacey, for this introduction. Paul, welcome to the webinar. It's a pleasure to have you here. Welcome to all the attendees. I see we still have climbing numbers, but quite a group has already joined. So we will start diving into it. This webinar will also be recorded or is being recorded. So you will also be able to see it afterwards if you feel like you missed a part or you feel like you want to go look it up again. Today's topic, we will take a deep dive into impact measuring. And before we get started, I would like to ask you guys a question to get a bit to know you a bit. And we would like to know what issue matters most to you. We will have a poll pop up in a moment where you will be able to pick two questions, two topics basically that of things that are most important to you. Stacey, do we have the poll?
Yes, 1 second. Someone said that they could not hear us, but I think we're fine now. All right, here we go.
Okay, I hope now it's working. Thanks for checking that.
Too. Launching the poll.
Wonderful. So what issues matter most to you? We would like to know which are the two topics that are most important for you. So go ahead and check two of those. Also then curious to see which are the two that are the most important for Paul. Maybe you want to quickly comment on that as well.
Well, I feel obliged to say that all of them are critical subjects in their own way. I think what's quite interesting is that, I mean, from our perspective, as people that have been operating in this area for quite this many years, these are topics that we've been dealing with for many years. But of course, many of you will recognize these are subjects that aren't just important for development, but that we see every day in the news as well now. And I think that's perhaps one of the trends behind the rise of impact investing, especially in the last few years, has been the fact that these are subjects that now on a very regular basis, you see people addressing in the news every single day.
All right, closing the poll now. We're at about 75% voted. Here we go.
Wonderful. We still have a couple of people coming in, so we see that obviously climate change is hot on the topic. We see that also in the media. I think that's by far a winner. Poverty is also high ranking. I think this shows quite nicely that there is a strong focus on these topics, and also shows that people are obviously very well aware that we need to look into a more sustainable future going forward, and this also concerns the way we do financing. Now, we've had in the previous couple of webinars, we've looked at several topics, including the difference between sustainable and ESG financing. We also gave you a toolkit on questions you wanted to ask. But today, my main question, or my first question to you, Paul, would be why and how do we need to measure impact? We've looked a little bit at impact investing, so some of the viewers that are reoccurring visitors have an idea of what it is, but I would really like to know from you as head of impact investing, head of impact at responsAbility, how and why do we need to actually measure impact?
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Samuel and Stacey, and thank you to everyone for attending today. It's a pleasure to be here. Look, I mean, on this question, I guess it seems like an obvious thing to say, but the reason why we measure impact is simply that when there is a product that or an investment that claims to be having an impact in some way, the idea is that impact measurement is meant to show whether it does what it actually claims to do. Now, obviously, as we've said, and I think Samuel has addressed in previous webinars, impact investing now covers an awful lot of different sectors, regions, asset classes. So the exact approach that you use to do that should always, by necessity, vary according to those circumstances. But if we pick one example, let's say a microfinance institution, if we want to know what how that microfinance institution addresses, has an impact on the subject of providing access to finance for low-income households, we might ask, well, look, how many, we might measure how many borrowers do they have to see the scale of their operations. We might measure what share of their clients are women, knowing that women tend to be disproportionately excluded from access to finance. We might ask, what is their average loan size, to really get an idea of to what extent are they actually dealing with low-income households and not big corporate clients, for example. So that is one example of how you might go about it. Now, in the case of an organization like responsAbility, this is made that a little bit harder by the fact that we're, I'm speaking from our own experience here, us and of course many of our competitors and many of the others operating in our area, we're only doing private debt and private equity in emerging and frontier markets. And what that means is that the data that I've just described, or that we often need, is not stuff that you can typically just call up on a Bloomberg terminal. This is data that we have to go out and get ourselves. So we will send out templates, we will collect the data, we will check it across our investment officers and across our team. We will then aggregate it and analyze it. So it is a process that takes a bit more time, but it's one that, of course, our investors expect us to do, because we have to be able to demonstrate, as I said, that we really are having an impact.
I guess this also kind of follows up on what we've just seen at the results from the poll, that all the people who answer, they say they're very they care a lot about, for example, energy or poverty. So it also means that we want to show to these people what their money is actually doing when they invest with these investment vehicles, that we have some data. Which then also brings me kind of to the next question, where we've talked a lot about measuring it, but every so often you also hear about impact management. So could you maybe give us a bit of an idea what actually the difference between impact measuring but also impact management is when we go about?
Sure, and I think it's an important question. I know maybe for some of the people on this call, it might seem like we're splitting hairs a little bit, but there is actually an important difference here. And it's one that's becoming more important as you get more and more companies and organizations entering into the impact space. Measurement is, as we said, it's important, but it's more about monitoring. I mean, typically you tend to measure something that's actually there. So it's about measuring something after it's happened, ex post. Impact management is more the idea that you try and embed impact throughout the process, that it's something that's holistic. So it's something where you start off, for example, with an impact narrative, a set of impact objectives, where you have what is sometimes known as intentionality, which is just a fancy way of saying, look, you have a reasonable idea of what impact you expect to achieve before you actually go and invest, which is, I think we can all agree, is a sensible thing to do. After that, yes, you monitor your impact, and ideally you review it at the end to see how your performance was versus what you actually achieved, or what you expected rather. And at the same time, you also look at elements like, well, what is your contribution? To what extent did your investment actually make a difference to the impact? And this is a concept that's also known as additionality. Again, just a fancy way of saying, well, look, what difference did my investment achieve? Would it have happened without me, frankly? So again, that's a difference between the two, but I think you will find that over time, that idea of impact management as opposed to impact measurement is one that will be increasingly widespread. And it's one that you've already seen, for example, with the launch of the operating principles for impact management, which are a set of principles which are intended to guide impact investors, and which was in fact recently covered this weekend. It was covered this weekend in the Financial Times.
Interesting. So basically also kind of summarizing to make sure that we're not only just looking at the output of what we're investing in, but also making sure that throughout the time frame or the time window, these things continue to be in line for what we're actually looking for. Before we move forward, I would like to ask a second question. So we could pop that up. Thank you very much. We would like to know from you, would you prefer to focus the impact of your investments on the developing world, the developed world, globally, or a particular region? Like Paul mentioned, we at responsAbility have a strong focus at the developing world. And maybe, Paul, you can maybe make a quick comment to, especially from an impact perspective, why our focus is on a developing world, even though we know that this is not only a developing world topic.
Yeah, no, I look, it goes without saying that you can have an impact. Pretty much anywhere, and of course, as we've seen from the news recently, the developed world has its fair share of problems and inequities. I think when I was just referring now to the subject of contribution and additionality, when it comes to many, but as I said, by no means all, important issues relating to development, especially, and impact, on average, you will see that a lot of those problems can be bigger in the developing world, which is to say that, look, if you have, if you are making an investment, for example, again, let's pick the example of the microfinance institution we picked before. An investment in a microfinance institution in Lima is going to have more of an impact than a microfinance institution in Lausanne, because the problem is bigger there. So this is where that idea of contribution can sometimes be not just about the investment you're making, but it's also about the context in which it occurs.
And it seems like this view is shared by most of the attendees here. We have over 50% would prefer their focus of impact investing to be focused on the developing world, even though globally we also see quite a strong desire. I would presume that also then kind of combines with the fact that we're looking at, for example, climate issues, which is something that we have to face on a global level and not just on a developing or developed world level. I think those are two very interesting feedbacks for us as well, to see what people are looking for and what their focuses. And I think this also then leads me to the next sort of topic that we would like to look at. We've mentioned it a bit in our second webinar, where we're looking at the different levels of sustainable investing going into ESG, environmental, social, and governance policies of the investment selection and so on. We hear it a lot in the news. Everybody's talking about it. Banks are talking about it. I was attending the Swiss Sustainable Finance launch of their report yesterday, where we learned that they had another 68% growth rate into sustainable investments year on year. But could you maybe from your stand give us kind of an insight of how do you differentiate between ESG and impact?
Sure. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, everyone's talking about it at the moment, and the problem, in my opinion, is that sometimes you can wind up with a situation where if everyone's talking about something, it means there's a lot of different definitions out there. But from our perspective, I think, and from my perspective, when we talk about the difference between impact and ESG, or environmental, social, and governance, ESG tends to be a do no harm approach. And this is, I think, mirrored by the fact that outside of our particular area, a lot of ESG investing approaches tend to focus on filtering out stocks and other securities that are, that do harm, so to speak, that are, for example, in tobacco or coal or weapons. So from our perspective, when we talk about ESG, we talk about ensuring that none of our investments have a negative effect, have a negative impact. Now, of course, this is critical. This is an extremely important point, but it should be said that any impact investor should be incorporating, as we do, ESG criteria into their investment process, because obviously it's important to say that if you're going to have a positive impact, you want to avoid a negative impact as well. But to qualify as impact investing, it's not sufficient to just avoid having a negative effect. You actually have to be going and making a positive contribution on your customers, on your staff, on the local environment, on the broader environment in the case of climate change mitigation. So I think that is the critical difference there when it comes to the difference between ESG and going beyond that and making a positive contribution with impact.
And I guess this is also where we then loop back into the measuring perspective, where it's not just enough to talk about it, but then you also have to measure and manage it to be able to prove that you're actually reaching where you're supposed to make this impact. We've now mentioned it multiple times that everybody's talking about it, and that there's a series of definitions and a bit of a confusion also sometimes, making it a bit difficult for especially private investors who don't have the huge amount of resources to do fund selection, to choose their investments, and also to kind of differentiate which one is the right kind of investment. If you then would maybe have a couple of points for our audiences here to take away from this webinar that you would suggest, what should they ask to their bank manager, to their investment advisor, key questions when they look at different sustainable or impact investing solutions, to feel a bit more comfortable that they know what's actually behind the curtains?
Yeah, well, yes. Imagining the situation, I guess the kind of the situation where your relationship manager or whoever else has sat you down and is saying, I have this product, it has amazing impact, here you go. Yeah, I guess if you really want to make sure that it's doing what you want it to do, I would start off, as we said before, with trying to say, well, what is the impact narrative here? What is the impact strategy? What do they claim to be doing? And how are their activities impactful? You might even go a little bit further and say, well, what are the sustainable development goals to which it is contributing? And then say, well, look, concretely, how do your activities contribute to that? How do you draw the dotted lines? And that's something you also sometimes hear referred to as a theory of change. Then to really demonstrate that, you might say, okay, great. What are the metrics that you use? How do you measure this? Have you got some numbers that demonstrate, the extent to which you're actually managing to achieve that? And of course, by all means, throw in some of the jargon that you've heard in this webinar today. Use, words like intentionality and additionality just to kind of, scare them a little bit. And of course, as we mentioned before, ask about the context in which it's operating as well, and say, well, look, is this, the problem that you're trying to resolve here, is this a particularly big problem in the context in which you're investing? Then after that, yes, you might want to go a little bit further and say, well, have you got some examples? Have you got some case studies? Give me a concrete example of an organization that you have invested in and how that organization has an impact, why you thought it would have an impact before you invested, how it had an impact, and what are the numbers behind it that show that it managed to achieve that, and how it contributed to your impact narrative. And then after that, I would go back to, but beyond all of that, I would say one of the most important points that you should also equip yourself with is the question we asked at the beginning, though, which is, well, what impact do you want? So yes, by all means, your relationship manager, your bank manager, whoever else can propose you something. But as we said before, impact investing covers quite a wide variety of things now. But I think it's important that for you to also have an idea of what subjects matter to you. Where do you want to have an impact? If impact investing is done well, it really can make a tangible difference. And I think it's important that you also have an idea of, what is important to you, what makes you angry, I guess also can be another side of that as well, and what issues you want to address with your investments.
Wonderful. And I think that also summarizes a bit what we were looking at in the last webinar number 3. We've also attached in the handouts the toolbox that we gave you in the last webinar that will help you to shape exactly these questions. And we added the answers or the suggestions that Paul just gave you in a handout that you can then go and basically use that as a guideline when you go and talk to your bank advisor or your investment advisor. With that, I would like to thank you, Paul, very much for your input. And before wrapping it up, we would like to open the floor to questions that you'd have. So if you have any points that you maybe have not been so clear, or you have specific additional questions that you would like us to address, I think this is now your chance. Like Stacy said as well, we will answer questions that we might not have gotten around to answer in the Q&A session now. So I would like to open the floor to the audience to ask us any questions that you would have at this point.
All right, I have the first question here, you guys. It is, what are the limitations to measuring impact?
That's That is a good question, and I think it's one that's important to point out as well. Well, the limitations, and again, I'll speak from our own side and from our own experience, is that a lot of the time, as I said, because this is data that we can't get from a third-party source, a lot of the data can be based on self-reporting by organizations. Now, we can double check this, as I said. We also have we use the experience and the insights of our investment officers who know the organizations very well and who are very capable of saying, hang on a second, that doesn't look quite right. We also, from time to time, there are plenty of organizations that we invest in that have third-party certifications. So to a certain extent, some numbers are audited. And then as an additional point, you often find that a lot of the impact data that is collected is more outputs rather than outcomes. And what I mean by that is that it will be something like, well, what is the number of borrowers of an organization, rather than, well, how much wealthier on average has each individual client become as a result of the loan. And the reason for that is that that latter part is something that is extremely hard to measure without an extremely detailed array of studies, which frankly speaking would require an awful lot of time and effort and is probably beyond our scope on the scale in which we invest.
All right, thanks, Paul. Next.
Probably, sorry, to add as well to this is at the moment that there's a bit of a lack of harmonization on the impact standards that also make it very difficult to compare. We hear this very often from discussions with relationship managers and also investors, that it's kind of difficult to compare different standards. Everybody has a bit of a different interpretation of the subject.
Yes, and I think that is starting to change a little bit over time. I hope, and there are, as I said, I've mentioned previous other initiatives, but I think this is something where we're starting to see a little bit of movement, or at least I hope so.
All right, we have a lot of questions coming, guys. So that's good news. Let's see.
Pressure on me.
So let's start with. And this is kind of feeding into what you're talking about. Do you guys have a dashboard or KPIs apart from the traditional economic factors to evaluate projects and investments, I guess, on the impact side?
Well, it will vary a little bit according to the business line. And again, as I mentioned, that is due a little bit due to the varying impact objectives and narratives. So some of our investments, perhaps for example, in the green lending space, the KPIs that they are going to incorporate are going to be along the lines of, well, what is the anticipated saving in carbon dioxide emissions? So that for them would be a key criterion which they would look at. In other spaces, it's going to be, for example, in the agricultural space, it would be more along the lines of, well, to what extent do we feel that this organization is contributing towards sustainable agriculture? To what extent, are they reaching out to smallholder farmers? And we'll have a series of metrics that try and look at those different objectives and try and come up with a coherent conclusion. We are in the process, as it happens, of rolling out a more complete and coherent a more consistent impact scoring across all of our products. But still, at the same time, the important point is to try and remain flexible in terms of the different, allowing for the different impact objectives and narratives of each of our products.
Thanks, Paul. Next question. What is your opinion of organizations tagging their activities with SDGs? Is this enough in terms of impact narrative?
Well, that's a really good question. I heard an anecdote the other day of someone who said they had heard of one organization that claimed to be achieving, I think it was SDG 2 on zero hunger, due to the size of their canteen in one of the American states. I hope that's just anecdotal. I think on one step, the SDGs are a very positive step forward. It allows us to all be aligned about, well, look, this is the end goal that we all want to get to. On the other hand, I think it's not enough to simply put logos on everything you do and think that's it. As we said before, the SDGs are a broad set of societal goals. They're goals for everyone, for all of us, to achieve justice, prosperity, and equality for all. But it's important to be able to draw a line between the specific activities that you are doing as an investor and these broad goals. So it's not enough just to put the logos on there. You need to be able to draw a line. You need to have metrics that show concretely how you are contributing to that.
And I think this is then also the task of, or part of the task of the investor, to look under the hood and what's actually in there, and not just buy the label, as you could say it.
Here's a question that.
Sorry, please go on, Stacey.
This ties into that a little bit. What would you recommend as far as studies are getting certified in order to have credibility in the impact and ESG space? Can you recommend a program or course that is recognized as credible globally?
I have taught at a couple of different classes. You'll have to forgive me, I can't remember the name, but we can share it later. There was one certificate on impact investing, I believe, out of University in Geneva, which I taught at last year and was scheduled to teach at this year until the current events. So they do exist. It's a relatively new space, but there are more and more of them emerging each day. At this point, I don't think there's a CFA equivalent, which is the definitive benchmark, so to speak. But they are popping up. This is perhaps something that we can share links to later on.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Next question. Is it an aim of responsAbility to align frameworks among investors to ease the process for all?
In as much as we can. As I said, so the challenge that we always have is, of course, that on the one hand, we want to give the truest and most accurate representation of the impact that we believe we're achieving. But on the other hand, we're very conscious of the fact that, yes, as one of the larger specialized players in the impact investing industry, we do have an obligation to try and lead the way on this a little bit, with our competitors. So we have been trying to align ourselves more and more with frameworks where we think that they make sense for us and they make sense, and where we think they'll be coherent for our investors. So, for example, we try and make sure that our metrics use what definitions defined under IRIS, which is a program to try and come up with common harmonized impact indicator definitions. The framework that we use is, as I've said, we are founding signatories, the operating principles for impact management, along with nearly 100 other impact investors, which is a set of principles designed to talk about the impact management process. And yeah, we're signed up to quite a few other different industry initiatives. As I said, I think we're starting to see there are 2 or 3 different programs, frameworks that are increasingly getting traction. I think the next 2 or 3 years will really see the number of initiatives that are out there being whittled down to the point where we can all agree on a core group.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Next question. Recently, there has been quite a bit of press about green swans. How does impact investing help address this issue?
I have to profess my ignorance and say that I'm not actually familiar with the term at all. So apparently I missed all that press. I'm assuming that
I'm guessing it means greenwashing, right?
Or conceivably it's a play on the black swan, which is the idea of something coming up that is so extraordinary and unusual. Yes, I can try and look into that and then come back to you on that. But I will immediately go and Google that after the event.
Makes the 2 of us.
All right, here's an interesting question. There is a great discussion on who has to pay for impact assessment, investors or MFIs. But if MFIs at the end are the clients the ones who have to pay, what do you think?
Well, look, on a practical level, I think both of us have to end up investing time and resources in it. The reality is that anyone investing in an impact product now expects, and rightly should expect, a degree of analysis of impact and of the topic of impact, and should expect a basic level of measurement and analysis along this level. This means that we as organizations have to invest in that. So hence the fact that you have my function within responsAbility and my team that I work with. Equally though, at the level of the microfinance institutions, or in fact any other organization that claims to be impactful, yes, you'll find they are increasingly assigning staff to deal with this. Now, this isn't obviously, I guess, part of the motivation for this is, look, if your investors ask for something, you provide it. But I think increasingly, of course, organizations such as microfinance institutions, they genuinely want to know. They have a social mission. They want to achieve impact, and so they want to invest time and resources in trying to understand, well, look, how can we have more impact? How can we be more efficient in terms of the use of our time and resources in achieving that core mission of ours, which is to increase financial inclusion, for example.
I think to add to this as well as you can also consider it as a sort of an additional risk screening, considering that you look to avoid certain negative consequences and contribute to positive consequences. The capacities in that is kind of an additional screening that then also safeguard your investments and potentially, as it's been proven through different studies, generates equal or even higher returns than conventional investments that do not go through these screening processes.
All right, we'll take one more question into overtime here. How do investors choose baselines for measuring impact? The nearest competitor or net impact from no economic activity? Should impact be measured and reported as relative or absolute? Thank you.
Gosh, I wonder if that was one of my team. I wonder if that was one of my team that asked that question. You've seen, I mean, I guess obviously there's been an attempt to try and align and as much as possible to try and make impacts harmonized and to try and compare things, because you do, as I said before, when you have when as an impact investor you're faced with the possibility of, okay, if I invest in this sector versus this sector, how do I compare the overall impact of this many people who achieve financial inclusion versus this many people who achieve access to education? So there is this shift towards, okay, well, can we try and come up with metrics that will somehow try and compare the two? One, the most famous being something like the impact money multiple, where you try and assign a dollar value to it. On a more basic level, I think, yes, wherever possible, if you can try and make impact relative to the amount invested, and we talked again about the concept of contribution. If you can try and make it, if you can try and work on a ratios perspective, for example, then that is obviously a positive thing. The problem with trying to go down the route of absolute numbers is that either you end up with a big number with, say, 1 million people reached, and you say, well, great, but what does that mean? Or you end up with trying to say, well, what is considered an acceptable level? In either respect, though, whether you're going with the absolute or the relative approach, in my opinion, the problem is that you can end up with is that you still at some point need to select a threshold by that token. You still need to say, well, what is an acceptable threshold? Now, for some subjects, you can clearly say, well, for example, for gender equality, if you have a number under 50%, that's not a great sign. But there are other subjects where, frankly speaking, you're at some point going to have to assign a threshold, and that's going to be the case with an absolute number or with a relative number. So that would be how I would choose to interpret that.
All right, we are over time, guys, so I just want to say thank you very much. Thanks for being here, Paul. Paul and Samuel will answer the significant number of questions that are left over, because we like to be honest about when we end our webinars and end them on vaguely on time. And because you saw me
as the man with all the answers as well. So now
exactly.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Paul. Anyway,
just as a short reminder, you have the handouts in the attachment. So if also refer to these. And then also from our side, thank you very much for attending, and see you next time.
And follow responsAbility on LinkedIn or any of us, and you will find the webinars following this one. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.